Human beings are programmed to approach pleasure and avoid pain. It's an instinct that dates back millions of years, to a time when people needed to actively seek food, clothing and shelter every day, or risk death. But psychiatrist Anna Lembke says that in today's world, such basic needs are often readily available, which changes the equation. Living in this modern age is very challenging. We're now having to cope with, how do I live in a world in which everything is provided? Lembke says. And if I consume too much of it, which my reflexes compel me to do, I'm going to be even more unhappy. Lembke is the medical director of addiction medicine at Stanford University and chief of the Stanford Addiction Medicine Dual Diagnosis Clinic. Her new book, Dopamine Nation, explores the interconnection of pleasure and pain in the brain and helps explain addictive behaviors, not just to drugs and alcohol, but also to food, sex and smartphones. Lembke says that her patients who are struggling with substance abuse often believe their addictions are fueled by depression, anxiety and insomnia. But she maintains that the reverse is often true. Addictions can become the cause of pain, not the relief from it. That's because the behavior triggers, among other things, an initial response of the neurotransmitter dopamine, which floods the brain with pleasure. But once the dopamine wears off, a person is often left feeling worse than before. They start out using the drug in order to feel good or in order to experience less pain, Lembke says. Over time, with repeated exposure, that drug works less and less well. But they find themselves unable to stop, because when they're not using, then they're in a state of a dopamine deficit. On the role dopamine plays in addiction, dopamine is a neurotransmitter that sends signals from one neuron to another, and it's probably the most important neurotransmitter in our experience of pleasure, motivation and reward. Dopamine is the final common pathway for all pleasurable, intoxicating, rewarding experiences. An experiment has been done in rats, for example, putting a probe in their brain, measuring the amount of dopamine released in response to different types of substances. Now, remember, we all have a baseline release of dopamine that's sort of always there. And then when we ingest certain substances or engage in certain behaviors, our dopamine either goes up or down in response to that substance or behavior. So, for example, chocolate increases dopamine above baseline about 50%. Sex is about a 100%. Nicotine is about 150%. And amphetamines is about 1000%. On how pleasure and pain processing overlaps in the brain. One of the most fascinating findings in neuroscience in the last 75 years is that the same areas of the brain that process pleasure also process pain, and that pleasure and pain work like a balance.